Stories about America to read aloud. Number 15, The Steamboat Race. It was nearly 5 o'clock on a summer afternoon. Two big white steamboats lay in the Mississippi River at New Orleans. Their smokestacks puffed out dark clouds of smoke. On the riverbank, many people crowded to watch an important event. The steamboats were getting ready for a race up the Mississippi River. Some people have called the race the most famous race that ever was. The boats were named the Natchez and the Robert E. Lee. And although nobody knew it then, one of them was going to set a record that has never been beaten. Out of the smokestacks, higher and higher in the blue summer sky, boiled bigger and bigger clouds of smoke. The smoke was getting blacker every minute because the firemen in each boat were throwing into their furnaces everything they could lay hands on that would make a good hot fire. A steamboat runs by steam, of course. The hottest fire makes the most steam. The most steam makes the fastest speed. So the firemen threw wood into their furnaces, and they threw lard and slabs of fat bacon and even whole hams. They threw anything that would flare up fast and hot. The captain of the Robert E. Lee was Captain Cannon. He stood on board his boat looking worried. He felt sure he had the fastest boat on the river, but most people said the Natchez was faster. Captain Leathers, who owned the Natchez, wasn't a bit worried. He stood on the Natchez main deck, laughing and making jokes. He felt sure that he had the fastest boat on the river. Usually the two steamboats looked a lot alike, but they didn't look alike on this June afternoon. The Natchez looked as she always did, but the Robert E. Lee was not at all like her beautiful self. In fact, she looked quite strange for a steamboat. The reason for her strange appearance was that Captain Cannon had gotten ready for the race by taking off his boat everything not needed to run it. He had had the crew take away the doors and glass windows, the shutters, parts of the rigging, the anchors. He wanted to lighten the weight and cut down wind resistance. And Captain Cannon couldn't carry any passengers or freight on this trip. He didn't want the extra weight. He didn't want to stop at landings along the river to let off passengers. Captain Cannon was really ready to race. But Captain Leathers on the Natchez was so sure his boat would win that he hadn't bothered to do anything special. He left the Natchez just as she always was, with windows and doors and all her embellishments. He took on passengers and freight just as he would for any regular trip. He had a different idea of the race than Captain Cannon. The time drew nearer to 5 o'clock. "Stand by for the bell, men," shouted Captain Cannon to his crew. He had had the Robert E. Lee tied to the dock by only one thin rope. And a man with an axe stood by, waiting to chop through the rope when the starting signal came. Suddenly it came, a bell ringing out one loud, clear bong. Quickly, the man swung his axe and chopped through the rope. A great gust of blackest smoke spurted from the smokestack, and the Robert E. Lee began her famous run up the Mississippi River. The Natchez was not quite ready. It was another 3 or 4 minutes before she, too, swung into the channel and started up the river to the city of St. Louis, more than 1,200 miles away, 1,200. "They're off!" cried the crowds on the bank, and the Robert E. Lee is ahead. So the great race began, with people all over the nation and even in faraway Europe cheering it on and waiting for news to tell them which boat was winning, for this was an important race. To understand why it was important, a person has to understand about steamboats and the Mississippi River. Mississippi, Mississippi, is an Indian word that means great river, and that is just what the Mississippi is, a great river running through the middle of America. The first people to travel on it were the Indians in their canoes. Then came explorers and fur trappers and pioneers. They rode the river on rafts and flatboats. Eventually, men learned to navigate the river by steam, and so steamboats came to the Mississippi. Oh, they were proud boats. They had 3 and 4 decks with sleeping rooms and parlors and dining rooms. Some had giant paddle wheels on the side. They were called side wheelers. Others had their wheels in back. They were called stern wheelers. All had two big smokestacks and a whistle that went woo! Woo! Some steamboats were longer than football fields and taller than four-story buildings. On the outside, they were painted white with bright red or blue trim. Inside, they had thick carpets and fine furniture and pretty pictures. The passengers had gay times and wonderful meals. Sometimes they had 17 kinds of dessert for dinner. Of course, the crew worked hard, but every man was proud of his boat and liked his work. It was the steamboats, and there were many of them going up and down the river, that opened the Mississippi Valley to people looking for places to build new homes. Sometimes the boats passed high rock bluffs, sometimes level fields. The sound of their whistles, woo-woo, woo-woo, ran through riverbank, farms, and Indian villages and frontier towns. Whenever a steamboat docked at a riverbank, all the people hurried to meet it. For the important thing about steamboats was that they carried freight, cotton, salt, tools, farm foods, all sorts of things, to the people living along the river. There were no trains in the West then, and of course in those long ago days, there were no airplanes or buses or trucks anywhere. Still, people found it necessary to travel from place to place and to get their goods to market. The Mississippi River was the great highway of the West. And just as today we like to talk about the fastest trains and planes, so in that day people were interested in which boats could go fastest. The race between the Natchez and the Robert E. Lee was supposed to prove just how fast river traffic could be. Well, it took almost 4 days to finish the race. Compared to our jets of today, that sounds very slow, but it was tremendous speed for a steamboat. All day and all night, the Natchez and the Robert E. Lee steamed up the river, their big paddle wheels churning the chocolate-colored water, for the Mississippi is a muddy river. Firemen kept throwing the wood and the hams and bacon into the furnaces. It must have smelled good up on the river banks, especially if you were hungry for fried ham or crispy bacon. But in time, of course, both boats ran out of fuel. Steamboats always did on the long trips and had to stop at river landings to get more wood. This time the Natchez stopped as usual, but Captain Cannon had a trick up his sleeve. 100 miles upriver, when the Robert E. Lee ran short of fuel, another steamboat was waiting with a load of wood. It raced to the Robert E. Lee. The two boats were tied together. Then they ran side by side while the wood was loaded onto the Robert E. Lee. That saved a great deal of time, of course. When the Natchez people saw what was happening, they sent up an angry shout. They said it wasn't fair. Later, the boats ran into a heavy fog, making it dangerous to travel. The Natchez stopped and tied up to a bank to wait for the fog to clear. But the Robert E. Lee kept going. Many times she almost ran into something that would have wrecked her, but she kept going. At last, 3 days, 18 hours, and 14 minutes after the rope had been cut away in New Orleans, the Robert E. Lee reached St. Louis. There were 10,000 people waiting to cheer for her as she steamed up to the dock. She was the winner, and she had set a new record. The Natchez didn't arrive until 6½ hours later. Well, that was all a long time ago. Nobody knew then that the days of the river steamboats were passing. Soon nobody would care about building faster boats. Soon fun and adventure and the danger would all be history. Barges and towboats would take the place of steamboats. Trains would carry freight overland. There would be no more woo-woo, woo-woo of steamboat whistles on the river. But though the steamboats are gone now, they will never be forgotten, especially not the Natchez and the Robert E. Lee. In fact, there's a song people often sing about a river pilot on the steamboat Whippoorwill. It's called Steamboat Bill, and at the end it goes, Steamboat Bill, steaming down the Mississippi, Steamboat Bill, a mighty man was he. Steamboat Bill, steaming down the Mississippi, going to beat the record of the Robert E. Lee. But of course, Steamboat Bill never did beat the record of the Robert E. Lee. Nobody ever did, not even in a song.